Hi, welcome to today's Understood Chat. Thank you so much for joining us. Today we're discussing strategies for managing your child's emotional outbursts. And we're so lucky because today we have with us child psychologist Ellen Broughton, PhD from the Clay Center for Young Healthy Minds at Mass General. And she's here today to answer your questions. But before we dive into questions, Ellen, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your history working with kids?
Sure. So, as you said, I am a child psychologist, and my area of clinical work is in pediatric neuropsychology. So, most of my clinical work is around assessing kids with emotional, behavioral, and learning differences. I also work at Massachusetts General Hospital, and I'm associated with the Clay Center for Young Healthy Minds, and also do some teaching at Harvard Medical School. And I was first involved with kids as a special education teacher. So my undergraduate training was in special education. So I have a very deep appreciation for the work that teachers do. And I'm also a parent. So I definitely have a lot of appreciation for parents, and especially with regard to what we're going to be talking about today, which is something that all parents have dealt with at one point or another.
Thank you so much. We are delighted to have you with us. For those of you who are watching, maybe for the first time, I'm going to give you a couple pointers for how this chat will work. To the right of the video screen, you'll see a chat box. And in that chat box is where you can ask questions that I will then ask of Ellen. We ask that you share as much information as you are comfortable with. The more information you share, the better it helps us tailor answers to you and your child. So, for instance, if you can tell us the age of your child, the grade they're in, things like that helps set up the question so that we can give you a helpful response. If you don't have a question, we welcome you to just say, hey, hi, let us know you're there in the chat box as we're watching, and you can ask questions throughout the chat. We'll get to as many as we can in the next half hour or so. So I'm going to start us off with a question for Ellen, and then we'll get rolling from there. So Ellen, what do we mean when we talk about a child having a meltdown? Is it different from a tantrum, and what does it look like?
It's a very good question. And these are terms that we use commonly. And so when I say there are differences between tantrums and meltdowns, it's not like we have a really great definition for these in the field of psychology, but we all sort of know what they mean. And when we're talking about a tantrum, we're talking about something not quite as significant as a meltdown. And a tantrum is an outburst when a child usually doesn't get what he or she wants. Like they're in the store, they want candy, the mom says no, or the dad says no, and they throw a tantrum because they want that. A meltdown is usually, like I said, more significant, and it's usually when a child is feeling completely overwhelmed about something. Very often it's sort of a sensory overload or a feeling, or they're overwhelmed with feelings. For instance, at a birthday party, when there's lots of sounds, they've eaten too much, they didn't get their nap, and everything feels like it's out of control for them. They might have what is called a meltdown, and that's more of something that they can't control too. So nothing often works to soothe a child who's having a meltdown, because it's a meltdown. So that's kind of what we're talking about. That's how those terms are sort of used.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful. The meltdown is not potentially controllable, and it can be sensory or, brought on by other things, where a tantrum often is not getting their own way. And it can be kind of difficult for parents to know the difference between the two, but when they learn them, it can be really helpful, which kind of leads to our next question. What are some of the reasons that kids might have a meltdown or emotional outburst?
So there are a lot of issues. So for when we're talking about tantrums, it's usually because they want something and they want to be controlling something. But kids have meltdowns for a lot of different issues. Sensory issues, which I mentioned before, are the most common ones. And think about this, even as adults, when we sort of feel like, oh my goodness, I can't take one more thing, we start to scream when we're driving in the car. It's because we are overloaded with whatever sensory things that are coming in. Even if we don't have a sensory issue, it might just be we're stuck in traffic, we're late, we're anxious, people are screaming, horns are blaring. So that's how it feels for a lot of kids with meltdowns. Anxiety is another thing that can be a very common trigger for a meltdown. And things like sort of irrational fears. Kids are just afraid of something, they don't know what they're afraid of. And then there's some more sort of simple explanations. Kids get hungry, they are tired. Sometimes they just want to test authority a little bit, but that's usually more in the category of a tantrum rather than a meltdown. Sometimes kids have just really poor language skills, and so having a meltdown is the best way they have to communicate their frustration when they can't use their language skills. And oftentimes it's a little bit of everything. Too much sensory input, anxiety, exhausted, hungry, those sorts of things are a perfect recipe for a meltdown. And usually a meltdown is more of a recipe that's been sort of put together rather than just one particular trigger.
I love that term recipe that's been put together, that it's multiple factors coming together.
Yeah.
Well, that kind of helps with our next question, which is, how can parents tell if their child is willfully throwing a tantrum to get what he wants versus a child being unable to control their emotions? How do parents really get at the root of that?
Okay, so one of the things that you want to think about is if a child is doing this to gain something, it's probably, and I think this is what you were asking, if they're looking to gain something, it's probably more of a willful sort of thing. So there's something that they're wanting. So, for instance, they don't want to have their nap, or they want to play more video games, or they're looking to do something in particular. That's probably more in the area of a willful thing that they can control. And, parents have all experienced, or most parents have experienced it, where the child is having sort of a tantrum, or they're not sure if it's a tantrum or a meltdown, and they start to walk away, and the child starts to be like, wait, what? Where are you going? That's more of a tantrum. That's clearly something the child can control. They were doing it to gain something. Whereas, again, if it's a meltdown, there is nothing you can do that will help them. I mean, and that's what makes meltdowns so much more complicated and scary for parents. So I think, I hope I answered your question, that what's the difference, but how do we tell the difference between the two?
I think you made some good points. Like, there are behavioral cues that the parents can pick up from the child to figure out if it's one versus the other. I have a question that I'm going to bring towards you, and it's kind of long, so excuse me for reading this one. And this is coming in from Trudy, and Trudy is asking for help on behalf of a friend of hers. And so she says, I'm looking for suggestions and help. One area you should be aware of is that he struggles with controlling his behavior at home. In school, he usually behaves well. If given freedom, though, he will attempt to be very silly, the class clown, or distract others. At home, it's a completely another story. He is amazingly sweet and gentle boy most of the time, but when he is off, it's really bad. He will scream and throw things and kick or hit walls. We've been trying to get help with knowing how to help him control his anger and have self-control at home.
So, did you give me the age of this child?
I don't have the age of this child, unfortunately. It's a child that's in school, and that's all I've gotten from this question. Sorry.
So, I think in this case, one of the things you want to do is figure out what is causing the difference in behavior, because that's going to really drive how you're going to figure out ways of controlling the behavior. So there are a lot of things this can be. One is that sometimes kids who suffer from anxiety do a great job of keeping their anxiety in check during the school day. And then they get home and they've dealt with a whole list of things that have made them anxious during the school day. They've tried very hard. They've been on their best behavior. And then they get home and they sort of release it all at home. They've had so much trouble just, keeping a lid on everything, like I said. That's one reason. So I would say you want to get a good outside input on what's really driving this child's behavior. Another thing, and this is oftentimes one of the first things people will blame, is that, it's the home situation, that there's not enough consistency, or parents are just letting the child walk all over them. My guess is that's probably not that simple, that there's probably a number of determining factors with this. And I think that's the key in these sorts of cases, is to find that out. But there probably is a piece as to what's happening in the home environment that's causing these kinds of triggers for this child. I also think that you want to talk to the child himself. I guess it depends on if we're talking about a 3-year-old who's in preschool or a 10-year-old. But I think in either case, you can say, next time this happens, how would you like me to handle this? Or what would help you next time when you're feeling this way? And there are a lot of strategies. I don't know if we want to talk about that quite yet, but there are a lot of strategies that you can do to sort of build self-regulation skills in a child. But it's hard to know, is this a child who has some other issues? Is there a learning disability that's causing him to feel frustrated at school that needs to be identified and treated so that he feels better when he gets home? Is it ADHD? Is this more impulsive? And so is it that at school that he's able to control his behavior because school is much more controlled, and at home it's harder to control those impulses? So there are a lot of different reasons for this. And I think we can talk about some general strategies, but the cause itself is really important to figure out.
I love that you said find out the cause, talk to the child. I wonder, as a follow-up question, if you could recommend, would a great next step for this parent be talking to a classroom teacher, talking to a counselor at school, a pediatrician? Where could, in their community, this parent perhaps turn for help?
So I always think the classroom teacher is the best place to start, followed by the pediatrician. And because those are two of the people who know your child best, especially the classroom teacher. Now, sometimes this is a great example of one of those cases where you can go to the classroom teacher, and the classroom teacher can say, but he's perfect here at school. That's still good information to have. And that doesn't mean that there's something wrong with the mom or the dad when they get home. It means that there's something about these environments and this child that's causing him to act differently. And it doesn't necessarily mean, again, that the mom's doing it wrong at home. It means that there's some sort of interaction between the environment and the child. So that's a good place to start. The teacher's really saying, I'm not seeing anything. Then what you want to do is you want to step back a bit, and then you want to talk to, maybe your next step would be the guidance counselor, the school psychologist, and say, I'm not sure what this is happening. And you want to then look at also what's happening at home. Are these sorts of behaviors happening when homework starts? Are happening when your child's feeling rushed in after school activities? You want to make sure, again, that you've checked out all of those things. But the best place to do is start with the teacher, check it out with the pediatrician. And then if you want to get even further, let's say people are saying, yeah, this is puzzling for me too. Then what you want to do is get an evaluation done either through your local school system or through a private psychologist to really look at what are some of the underlying things that could be causing your child to act in this way.
I think those are such helpful kind of people to reach out to and next steps that this parent can take. I have a question coming from someone who is also named Meg. And this Meg asks, my son has meltdowns regularly after seemingly benign requests, asking to put things away, reminding him of rules, etc. It's probably worse when it's something he is frequently reminded of, but I feel like I'm walking on eggshells. He also seems to have started soothing these emotions with eating, and I'm not sure how to help him.
Oh, well, this is a great question. And the walking on eggshells is just the worst feeling for any parent or family. I would actually say in this kind of case, if you really, when I hear, there are a couple of phrases that I hear that I think, you probably want to talk to somebody else about this, because walking on eggshells means that it means like in general, it feels like there's an unease in the family and you're afraid of what you're doing. I would say this is a perfect sort of example of going to consult with the school psychologist or a psychologist and get some techniques as to what's happening. This is not the sort of thing that you need to go for years for therapy, but sometimes even just 3 or 4 sessions with a psychologist to help you figure out the triggers for this, because it sounds to me like there are some triggers. Now, one of the things you might want to do is to also start doing that yourself, which is to kind of look at what's happening at this time of day. Is your child exhausted? Is he hungry? Is there something that he's scared of? Is he having trouble expressing his needs? Again, I mentioned that before. Like sometimes kids will do that because they don't know how to talk about their inner emotional experience or even just what's going on with them. So helping them to do that and to learn how to do that is important. Other things that you can do in these cases are sort of distract them or head off, know when these triggers are going to happen and head it off. But again, when I hear things like walking on eggshells, it makes me think like, you're as the parent feeling like you're anxious. This is making you anxious and feeling worried, and you don't want to do the wrong thing. And so sometimes talking to somebody could be a very good idea. And it could be as simple as, if you've got a great pediatrician or a great school psychologist, or sometimes just going and talking to, a counselor and getting some techniques is a great thing.
I think that's really helpful. And it's helpful for parents to know that, it's encouraged for them to ask for help from outside sources. You've got people who are with your kid while they're in school all day, and there are support systems in that school that it's great to take advantage of to help make sure your child is thriving. This next question, I am not 100% sure if I know what it is, so if you do, great. If not, we can move on to another question. But this question comes from A. Gills, and she says, do you have any suggestions on how to use, and this is in quotes and capitalized, feeling flashcards at home?
I don't. Okay. Now, I wish I might be able to guess if that's like something that you use when you're like feeling in a certain way, and a child might use that as opposed to having to come up with the right word. I know there are different things where sometimes even in therapy, psychologists will have different sorts of faces that will give a child the ability to sort of look at one and point to one, like, that's how I felt when I was in this situation. So if that's what they're talking about, it can be a great tool to use.
Awesome. This question comes from N. Seagal, and I think it's something a lot of our parents will be able to relate to. And she says, do you have suggestions on how to teach a child to recognize a meltdown is coming and what they can do to help, especially at school when the parent isn't there?
Yes, I think one of the things that you want to do, and does not quite answer this particular question because everybody wants to know, what do we do before it's coming? But I think the way we do that is to analyze what happened after it's over. So after a meltdown, after a tantrum, you want to follow up with that and teach your child emotional words. Boy, it seemed like you were really angry before when your toy wasn't working or your game wasn't working the way you wanted to. It's that sort of thing that will help teach them. And I also think as a parent, you've got to be always on the lookout as to what might be causing those things so that you can start to identify that in your child so that they can start to internalize that. I know you can't do that when they're at school, but the one way that you help them learn that is for you to be able to say, oh, it looks like you're looking kind of frustrated right now, or it looks like you're a little nervous right now. What can we do right now to change that? And I think that is the key, is to sort of on either side. It's hard to change things when you're in that moment, but on either side to be really aware of what the triggers are, and then also to follow it up with giving a child an emotional vocabulary and sort of analyze what happened. And I think that I was just going to say something else about that. One of the things you also want to do, I mentioned having, knowing what your child's triggers are. You want to teach your child what his triggers are as well. So, for instance, if he always has these sorts of things when he's really hungry, there are lots of kids who are picky eaters, or some kids who are on medication for ADHD, which makes them not so hungry during the day, which can cause, but hunger can be one of those things. So sometimes it doesn't really mean sort of teaching your child how to pick up on even their feelings, but to know that, oh, I'm hungry, I better eat something, because when I don't eat something, then that makes me more prone to acting out. So those are the sorts of things that you can teach them. Also things like, I'm feeling exhausted, or I'm really tired, or really I'm feeling scared. So yeah, teach them the words that go along with the triggers.
I love that term that you said, emotional vocabulary, and helping our kids being able to vocalize it is what they're feeling and what's going on internally, so that maybe they are a little bit more willing and able to ask for help or address those triggers like hunger that you mentioned as an example.
Mm-hmm.
This next question is not super specific, but I think we might be able to have a little chat about it. This parent asks, what can you tell me about teens? Typical behavior at this age already isn't great, but how can we tell the difference and build the skills they need without burning out a child who could be having these emotional outbursts?
So can you just say it one more time? Teens, like teenagers?
Yeah, and like typical teenage behavior is already kind of emotional and hormonal. Yes. And so what's the hormones and what might be something different, and how can we build skills at that age when they're dealing with so much?
Right. So, it really depends on girls and boys. They do have a lot of differences in hormones, differences in development. Their brains, the brains of teenagers they're primed for pulling in information, but they're not groomed for being able to be discerning about information. So, our brains sort of grow into young adulthood, and the way that the adolescent brain is that it's a real stimulus seeking kind of brain. And as they get older, our brains get pruned. We start to lose neurons, basically, and that's a good thing because then it makes us more discerning. So to know that your adolescent's going to make mistakes and going to be sort of primed for emotional dysregulation. I think one of the things you want to do as a parent of a teen is to be discerning about what is just sort of like the kind of thing where they're just blowing off steam and you just need to nod your head and let it go, and other things that are really causing them to be out of control. Now, an adolescent's meltdown is going to look very different from a preschooler's meltdown, but sometimes not so different. So if your adolescent is yelling about something that happened at school and you don't understand, that's sort of typical adolescent angst. When they're starting to throw things, break things, get so mad that they're breaking their phone, that's more of a meltdown situation. That's where you really want to make sure that other things in their life are going well. And for an adolescent, we're probably not talking about overstimulated in terms of sensory input. We might be talking about a child or an adolescent who's feeling somewhat depressed, who may also be very stressed or anxious, who's sleep deprived perhaps, and who has trouble with maybe some other issues that you want to identify or maybe have been identified, but you want to make sure they're well treated. Things like ADHD or specific learning disability. Sometimes in adolescents who have learning differences or attentional differences, they're at increased risk for feeling frustrated, and that's understandable. So you want to make sure then that you're doing everything you can to help them in the areas that you can help them, because a lot of times the frustration and the meltdowns really have nothing to do with their inability to control their impulses, but with their ability to control their life and their ability to be successful. And that's really the task of adolescence, is to learn how to be an independent person. And anything that's getting in their way for that is something to look at and then manage.
That's really helpful. Okay, I have another question that's a bit long, but we've got a lot of information in it, so I'm going to read it slowly, but feel free to ask me about it. So my son has acute thyroiditis, which was later changed to hypothyroidism. He's always been sensitive, but his emotions are challenging now, and he has emotional meltdowns and crying fits or tantrums. He will be 10 in November, is on Synthroid, and is showing early signs of starting puberty. With his conditions, his levels get off easily, and he's beginning to show signs of anxiety an inability to accept responsibility. Nothing is ever his fault, and thinking the world is against him. Naturally, he tends to save it all for mom and is keeping it in check at school. I'm looking for tips on how to help him process through his emotions rather than acting out. He doesn't know exactly what's wrong with his thyroid, as I don't want it to be an excuse for him, but this creates a level of fatigue in him which compounds everything. Any suggestions about working through emotions would be appreciated.
Well, it sounds like you're doing a wonderful job with your child. It's a lot for a mom to handle. I think one of the things I just have to say is you want to make sure that medically they are doing everything they can to keep his emotions regulated, because this could be as much of a medical issue as it is a behavioral or psychological issue. And I would really encourage you to go to your doctor and to really talk to somebody who has a sophistication about these issues and how they interact with behavior and emotions, because it could be that we could give the best recommendations, but if it's a thyroid related issue, it's going to be really hard to control that kind of medical issue. However, I do think that when a child has a medical issue, I think it is important for them to understand how that might change their behavior and their emotions. And I think I'm with you on the fact that you don't want to use that as an excuse. Nothing should be used as an excuse. If a child has ADHD, that's not an excuse to misbehave. It helps us understand why. And that also sometimes understanding why did I feel so out of control? If it's a hormonal thing, it can be helpful to know that I really couldn't control that. And so it can in some ways be helpful then in terms of, knowing that there are times that this is sort of who you are, and I don't know. Education is just a good thing, and I'm with you on the fact that we don't use that as an excuse. The other thing you want to do is help again. I've talked about this before. Understand their triggers, and if you've got a child with a medical issue as well as this kind of anxiety, and they're keeping it all for you, you want to make sure that they understand their triggers and they can talk about it. And I don't know if in this case there are some triggers that have to do with just timing of the day in terms of how the hormones are regulated. That might be an important thing for you to analyze, and that can be very helpful for a child at that age to sort of look at this as like a scientific experiment. Well, let's see what does happen. Why am I always like this at this time of day? That kids at that age are primed for that. I also think that empathizing with them and knowing that it's hard for them, it's hard for you. And then also, if you know that there's a certain time of day when this happens, is to find a space or a way, or talking with them about, every day you get home and at 4:30 we're getting in a fight. What can we do differently that will change this? And figure out with them what that would be. And usually playing on the video games is what a child is going to say, but maybe coming up with something a little bit different might be a better way to approach that.
I think that's super helpful. And I think one thing that we've heard from other parents, you keep mentioning finding out what a child's triggers are and then having conversations about that, which is incredible advice. And I think sometimes parents don't necessarily take the time to track it, and a journal can be really helpful. So writing down to see if you can then, after a few weeks, figure out the pattern, because it might not be something that a parent can recognize immediately, but if after tracking for a bit, they might be able to decode some sort of pattern in that behavior and then have conversations. I think we have time for one last question, and it seems like a great question to end on. This parent says, I understand the differences between meltdowns and tantrums, which is great. That means our conversation has been successful. And they're asking for some concrete ways to help diffuse the meltdown from escalating. So if a meltdown has started, what can a parent do in that moment so that it doesn't get even more out of control?
Okay, so I think one of the things you want to do is to be calm and yet somewhat detached. You don't want to engage. The last thing a child wants when he's having a meltdown is somebody, what's wrong with you? What's wrong? Or even worse for a parent to get mad. So you want to be somewhat detached. You want to make sure your child's not hurting himself in any way. You want to empathize with them and give them the space they need. Some kids respond well to touch. If that's the case, you want to do that. Sometimes it's helpful for kids for you to say, do you want to sit on my, I can see you're really upset right now. Do you want to sit on my lap, or do you want me to leave you alone? Of course, they might say, I don't want anything. But at least you're giving them some choices in that case, and you're helping them sort of get themselves out of that. So by giving them some very simple choices, you're helping them get beyond that sort of feeling of just being overwhelmed. And you know, again, I said this earlier, after this happens, you want to ask them what they think would have been helpful in that situation. Keep that in mind then for the next situation. They might have said, I just wanted you to leave me alone. I didn't want you talking to me. I didn't want you, or whatever it is. So knowing that's what it is. I think for some kids, if you've developed a routine around it, let's just say they have these frequently, you know, having them have a squeeze ball or a punching bag or something that they can do. And the other thing that we kind of forget about, especially with younger kids, is just distracting them. You know, sort of, again, very calmly, kind of matter-of-factly, just distracting them with something else. Sometimes that can get them beyond it. And then, you know, other times they will get out of this. They will. You know, it's not like it's going to last forever. When you're a parent, you think, oh, they're never, especially if it's happening in a store, you're thinking this is never, you know, we're never going to get out of this. But you know what? Eventually, if you sort of ignore it as much as you can while making sure they're safe, eventually they'll come around. And so being able to you yourself get through it, I think, is important.
Yeah, I think calm and detached are key things, and sometimes very difficult for a parent to do, but if they can practice that.
Oh. It's the hardest thing for parents to do. I mean, to remain calm when your child is having a meltdown or is distraught about anything is the hardest thing to do. But I think it actually is, it shows them that even though they're feeling out of control, they're not. You know, everything's going along fine. The parents are in control. And so I think it's a very helpful thing. And it's a skill, you know, some of these things we're talking about are skills that we parents have to do ourselves.
Absolutely. Well, that is our time today. Ellen, thank you so much. Do you have any kind of last words or closing words for our parents that are watching today?
Well, you know, one of the things you asked me about before time is what do you do when onlookers see you and your child with who's having a meltdown? And I just think it's good to mention, because every parent has had this experience at one time or another. And I really did a lot of thinking about this, and really, there's nothing you can do. Just ignore them and move on. Don't let them get to you.
I think that is perfect advice for our parents. To those of you who are watching who may not have gotten your question answered today, we apologize that we didn't have time, but we have this incredible place called the Understood Community. You can visit it at u.org/community, and there are experts like Ellen who are in these chats and discussion boards all the time. So we encourage you, if you didn't get your question asked there, to ask it in our community, and someone will get back to you. Sometimes it's other parents and experts, sometimes it's just experts, but take a look, dig around, and we think you can find some really valuable resources there. Ellen, thank you for your time. If you want to know what chats are coming up, you can visit u.org/calendar. We thank you for joining us today and hope you have a wonderful day.
Bye.